You ever wake up to the sound of jackhammers tearing through your peace, only to find a pool being built on your land and a woman in heels yelling at workers like she owns the planet? That was my Tuesday. And the best part? When I confronted her, she actually sipped her mimosa and said, "You should thank me for increasing your property value." Right then and there, I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just turned around, walked back inside, opened my old wildlife permit drawer, and smiled. Karen had just declared war on the wrong man, and she didn't even know I had access to live alligators. It started just like any other early morning on my little stretch of heaven, tucked right on the edge of our neighborhood. I'd bought this 5-acre slice before the HOA ever existed, back when the land was cheap and the silence was golden. My property was clearly fenced, clearly deeded, and very clearly not part of the HOA's meticulously trimmed community of gray houses and identical flowerbed. I liked it that way. Peaceful, quiet, simple. Until Karen showed up. I first met her when she tried to find me for overgrown wilderness on my own land. She handed me a warning and told me to mow my back pasture, which happened to be a wildlife recovery zone I'd carefully cultivated. I explained, politely, that I wasn't part of the HOA. She rolled her eyes and said, "Well, you're close enough to influence community morale." That was the first red flag. The second one came when she showed up a few weeks later with a measuring tape and started walking along my fence line like she was staking a claim. I made it clear, legally and verbally, that she had no authority here. She muttered something about future expansion and disappeared. Fast forward to Tuesday. I was sipping my first cup of coffee when I heard heavy machinery in the distance. Thought it might be a neighbor doing some landscaping, until the sound got louder and closer. By the time I got outside, a construction crew had already ripped out part of my back fence. A trench was being dug, forms were laid for concrete, and several guys were pouring what looked like a foundation for a pool. I approached the foreman, a sunburned man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What the hell is going on here?" I asked. "Pool installation," he said. "Per HOA specs." Karen approved it. Said this area was cleared for community use. I blinked. "This is my land." He looked genuinely confused. "She gave us permits. Even had the property lines marked." That's when she showed up. Hair perfectly curled, oversized sunglasses on her face, clipboard in hand, and that ever-present smirk. "Karen." She waved like we were old friends. "Oh good, you're here. I wanted to surprise everyone with a luxury pool for HOA event. Isn't it beautiful?" "Karen," I said through clenched teeth, "you're building it on my property." She laughed. "Don't be silly. The HOA has rights to expand onto adjacent parcels if they're not developed." I pointed to my house, my barn, my crops, and my no trespassing sign. "It's developed. By me." She rolled her eyes. "Look, if you're going to make a scene, I'll have to bring this up with the board. Or the city. This is for the good of the community. And honestly, you should be grateful. Property values will skyrocket. You can even use the pool, if you behave." I just stared at her. There's a special kind of fury that comes from watching someone violate your space and then act like they're doing you a favor. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just took a deep breath, turned around, and walked back to my house. I could hear her chuckling behind me. Once inside, I went straight to my old filing cabinet and pulled out my retired wildlife officer badge. Then I flipped to a folder labeled Special Permits, Reptile Relocation. You see, before I retired, I worked closely with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I specialized in handling nuisance alligators. I had contacts, legal permit, and a very specific knowledge of what qualified as a secure, natural aquatic habitat. So I made a few calls. One to my buddy Dennis, who still worked with reptile relocations, another to my lawyer, just to make sure everything I was planning stayed within the fine lines of legality, and finally, a quiet, Anonymous tip to the local assessor's office to let them know that someone was building without permits on surveyed private land. Later that day, Karen came back, beaming as the pool's outer shell was finished. She had lounge chairs delivered, ordered umbrellas, even scheduled a DJ for a grand HOA pool reveal over the weekend. It wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was full-blown delusion. That night, under the cover of stars, I stood by the pool with Dennis. We inspected the concrete. It was big enough, deep enough, and, after some modifications, perfectly acceptable for a temporary holding site for a few juvenile alligators. We weren't breaking any laws. These weren't wild captures. These were relocated gators from overpopulated areas, moved for conservation and education purposes. Fully licensed. Properly documented. The next morning, as the sun rose over the HOA's pastel rooftops, 3 gators swam lazily in the new pool, splashing in the water Karen had so proudly filled just hours earlier. I added a sign to the gate. Caution, a wildlife habitat, authorized entry only. Then I sat back on my porch with a coffee and waited for the show. I didn't have to wait long. A shriek echoed across the fields around noon. Karen's pool party prep had officially collided with reality. And I knew this was just the beginning. Because if Karen wanted a war, she was about to learn the hard way. This gator pond wasn't going anywhere. The morning after the great gator surprise, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating off the nightstand. I glanced at the caller ID and smirked. It was Dennis. "They're loving it," he said, laughing. "Those gators are swimming like royalty in that concrete palace. You did say we could leave them there for a few days, right?" I told him he could leave them as long as the permits allowed and the habitat remained safe. "Perfect," he said, "because I just got another call from Animal Control saying someone reported a crocodile invasion at an HOA pool." We both knew who had made that call. I wasn't surprised when the first official vehicle pulled up to the edge of my property before noon. A tan SUV marked County Animal Services, parked right beside the broken section of fence Karen's crew had knocked over days earlier. A middle-aged officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, clearly not expecting to be greeted with 3 sunbathing gators beside a newly poured pool. He looked from the reptiles to me and raised an eyebrow. I walked over with a stack of papers in my hand. "I'm guessing you're here about the gators," I said. He nodded. "Yup. Got a report that they're a public danger and someone's running an illegal exotic zoo." I handed him the documents: wildlife relocation paperwork, educational permit, property boundary certification, and yes, a copy of the email from my lawyer confirming that no part of this setup violated any state laws. The man flipped through the paperwork, whistled low, and muttered, "You really covered your bases, huh?" I shrugged. "Just protecting my land. Those gators didn't choose this pool. They were relocated for safety, and apparently, it's better maintained than some of the actual wildlife facilities." He chuckled and nodded toward the house next door. "And her," I smiled. "She built the pool without permit, on land that doesn't belong to her, then tried to throw a party in it." He shook his head. "I'll file the visit as a non-issue. You're good here." Then he climbed back into his SUV and drove off. Just as he disappeared down the road, I noticed Karen storming toward me from the opposite direction, flanked by 2 of her HOA board members, one of whom looked like he regretted ever accepting the position. Karen's face was flushed red, her lips pressed tight. She didn't even pretend to be civil this time. "You're going to remove those monsters right now," she snapped. "This is a family-friendly neighborhood, not a reptile breeding ground," I replied calmly. "You mean the pool you built illegally on my land? The one your HOA voted on without jurisdiction? That pool," she scoffed. "This is a health hazard, a liability, I held up a hand and handed her the same stack of papers I gave the Animal Services officer. "All legal. All certified. You built on my property. I'm simply making use of it." One of her board members tried to whisper something to her, but she waved him off. "This isn't over," she hissed. I figured it wouldn't be. Which is why I made my next stop the county assessor's office. I brought in old plat maps, deed paperwork, drone footage of the construction, and photos showing the property line before and after the pool. The woman behind the counter looked over the documents and frowned. She built an HOA pool over your property line? I nodded. Without a permit, without approval, and without even asking. She made a low, disbelieving sound and asked for a copy of everything. We'll send out an inspector and notify the zoning department, she said. They'll want to take a look at this immediately. I thanked her and walked out knowing that the machine had started turning, and there was no way for Karen to stop it now. When I got back home, Dennis was waiting on the porch with a big grin. You're not going to believe who just stopped by, he said. A blogger. Apparently your Gator pool went viral. I raised an eyebrow. Already? He nodded. Someone from across the street filmed Karen screaming at the Gators and uploaded it. It's already got 50,000 views. And that's before the local news picks it up. I sighed, partly amused, partly exhausted. I hadn't planned to turn my home into the center of a social media circus, but if it helped expose Karen's abuse of power, I wasn't going to complain. Later that evening, as I grilled dinner on the back porch, a drone buzzed overhead. I looked up to see it hovering near the pool, camera blinking red. Dennis, who hadn't left yet, laughed. Guess the internet's hungry for more Gator content. I shook my head. They better be careful. Those drones might catch Karen's next meltdown live. Just as I said that, Karen herself marched up the driveway again, this time with a local reporter in tow. She gestured wildly at the pool, waving her arms as she gave some dramatic speech about reckless animal ownership and safety concerns. The reporter turned to me, probably expecting a defensive reaction. Instead, I calmly handed him the paperwork I'd been carrying everywhere for the past 2 days. He read a few lines, looked at Karen, and then asked, So, you built this without a permit? Her face contorted. That's not the issue. The Gators are the issue. But the damage was done. The reporter thanked me, promised to present both sides, and left. Karen turned and stormed off again, screaming something about lawsuit. That night, the local news ran the segment. The headline read, Alligators, HOA, and one very angry neighbor, suburban drama in action. They aired clips of the Gators, the pool, and Karen's frantic rant. But what really nailed it was the footage of me calmly explaining the legal permits and how Karen's unauthorized pool triggered the whole thing. The comments section was pure gold. My favorite one read, Plot twist. Florida man is actually the good guy this time. By the end of the week, the Gator Pond had become a local attraction. Neighbors I'd never even met before were walking by the edge of the property, peering through the fence to get a glimpse of the lazy reptiles. Kids pointed. Adults took selfies. A few even asked if I did tours. I politely declined, but I did put up a sign that said, Welcome to Karen's Pool, now a wildlife refuge. No lifeguard on duty. Gators only. Dennis thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to disappear for a day or two, probably busy plotting her next move. And I had a feeling it was going to be loud, illegal, and absolutely destined to backfire. The calm didn't last long. On Monday morning, I opened my front door to find an envelope taped to it. The paper inside had the HOA's logo stamped at the top and a bold header that read, Cease and desist. According to Karen, the presence of alligators on my property violated neighborhood safety protocols and posed a direct threat to community well-being. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. This woman had literally built an unauthorized pool on my land, and now she wanted to pretend I was the threat? The absurdity of it all was reaching new heights, and the more she pushed, the more she made herself look ridiculous. I took the letter inside and called my lawyer, who was already well into drafting the lawsuit for trespassing and property damage. He read the letter, paused, and then snorted. She really put this on HOA letterhead? I told him yes, and he replied, She's digging her own hole. Just document everything. This letter? That's another nail in her legal coffin. I scanned and emailed it to him. Then I printed a copy, walked outside, and pinned it to the fence beside my hand-painted Gator sign with a note under it that read, Official Comedy Exhibit A. It didn't take long for someone to snap a photo and post it online. The image spread like wildfire. Karen's official-looking cease and desist, stuck next to a cartoon gator holding a martini, became meme material overnight. That afternoon, the real escalation began. Karen didn't just want to fight with letters and passive-aggressive lawn signs anymore. She wanted control. I was sipping iced tea on my porch when I noticed several unfamiliar cars pulling up at the HOA clubhouse across the street. People in suits stepped out, including one who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Nixon administration. A few minutes later, a drone lifted into the air, hovered over my property, and started taking sweeping shots of the pool and gators. I grabbed my binoculars and watched as Karen, standing with arms crossed, pointed directly at my house and began speaking animatedly to the suited group. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She'd hired private inspectors or a legal consultant team to look for any possible violations she could twist into a case against me. What she didn't know was that the entire area was rigged with motion-detecting trail cams from my wildlife days. Every time one of her people stepped 1 inch over the property line, I had it on video, time-stamped, geotagged, and perfectly clear. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I was gathering every piece of evidence needed to gut whatever case she thought she had. That night, I uploaded several clips to a private cloud folder I shared with my attorney. One showed a man in a suit trying to visually inspect the pool by walking 6 feet into my yard. Another showed Karen giving orders to her board members while they scribbled notes, one of them visibly frustrated. The most damning clip, though, was Karen bragging into a phone, saying, "He's a joke. The moment we file public nuisance, the county will shut his swamp zoo down. We'll win by default." That audio alone was enough to turn her entire strategy inside out. The next morning, as predicted, I received a visit from a zoning inspector. Unlike Karen's consultants, this guy was the real deal, county badge, official vehicle, and a no-nonsense demeanor. He walked up to my gate and asked if I had a moment. I led him to the pool, offered him a bottle of cold water, and handed him every permit, land survey, deed copy, and wildlife authorization document I had prepared. He reviewed everything carefully. Then he walked the perimeter, checked the fencing, observed the gators, and took note. After 30 minutes, he turned to me and said, "Mr. Collins, I'm going to be frank. This setup is unusual, but it's fully legal. The wildlife is permitted, your land boundaries are clear, and the structure, while built without your consent, is technically sound. I'll be filing a report that the pool's construction violated zoning ordinances due to being built across parcels without permission, but that's on her, not you." I thanked him and asked if he needed anything else. He shook his head and added, "Frankly, she's making a lot of noise for someone on the losing end of this." Word spread quickly that the county's inspection had gone in my favor. HOA board members started getting cold feet. One even approached me outside the hardware store and whispered, "She never told us it wasn't on HOA land. We were told it was a donated easement." I told him the truth. There was no easement, no donation, just Karen's fantasy empire built on arrogance and concrete. He looked pale and left without buying anything. Karen, however, wasn't done. A few days later, a health department vehicle arrived. Apparently, she'd filed an anonymous complaint that my property was harboring unsanitary reptiles and posing a risk to drinking water. The inspector, a younger woman named Lynn, was professional and polite. I showed her the filtration barriers, the feeding schedule, and the biosafe fencing installed around the pool. I explained that the gators were not fed live prey, were under observation, and were regularly inspected by Dennis, who held a valid wildlife health certificate. She checked everything and left with a thumbs up. Later that day, I saw her interviewing Karen outside the HOA office. Her expression said it all: confused, mildly annoyed, and entirely unconvinced. Then came the best part. The HOA was scheduled to hold a community meeting about ongoing property disputes and liability concerns. Karen made flyers, rented out the community hall, and even hired a videographer. But she forgot one crucial thing. Legally, she couldn't bar me from attending. And attend I did. I walked in carrying a folder thicker than a phone book, sat in the front row, and waited. When Karen started her presentation, complete with dramatic language about hostile reptile installations and community sabotage, I raised my hand. "I'd like to offer clarification," I said. Then I stood and calmly laid out every fact. The illegal pool construction, the forged easement, the trespassing, the letters, the video evidence, the county's inspection result, the health department's clearance, and finally the ongoing lawsuit. The room was silent. One board member stood up and said, "Wait, she used HOA funds for this?" Another whispered, "Didn't we vote against this 3 months ago?" And just like that, her support started crumbling. Karen tried to scream over me. "He's manipulating the facts. This is about community safety." But no one was listening anymore. I didn't need to say another word. I'd brought the truth, and she'd brought theater. The meeting ended with murmurs of special elections and financial audit. Karen stormed out with her videographer trailing behind, yelling for him to cut the footage before the traitors twisted the narrative. As I walked back home, I passed the pool, now quiet and rippling under the evening sky. The gators floated peacefully, unaware of the chaos their presence had caused. I smiled. Karen had come to conquer, but instead, she handed me the perfect opportunity to expose everything. And judging by the way her kingdom was cracking, the best was still yet to come. The week after the HOA meeting felt like watching a building crumble in slow motion. Karen had spent years climbing to the top of the neighborhood's petty political pyramid, and now it was all collapsing brick by brick. She tried to keep her grip, issuing desperate emails to HOA members, calling emergency board meetings, and even putting up signs claiming my Gator pond was a community emergency zone. No one was buying it anymore. Her own allies were backing away like she had a contagious disease. The board started dodging her calls. A petition for her removal quietly began circulating, and several residents reached out to me directly, not to complain, but to apologize. One afternoon I found a note taped to my mailbox. It read, "We didn't know. We're so sorry. Please don't blame the whole neighborhood for one person." There was a homemade pie left with it. Another day, an older gentleman named Tom from 3 houses down stopped his golf cart at the end of my driveway and said, "She fooled a lot of us. We thought you were just being difficult. Turns out you were protecting what's right." It wasn't exactly an apology parade, but it was enough to show that the tide had turned. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't going down quietly. The very next day, she filed an emergency motion at the county courthouse attempting to get a temporary restraining order against me and a removal order for the Gators. She claimed they were part of an intentional campaign of emotional terrorism and cited psychological distress, sleeplessness, and a recent birdbath incident involving a lizard. The court clerk, apparently used to such drama, scheduled the hearing without comment. When I showed the notice to my lawyer, he rolled his eyes and said, "Let's just treat this like the final tantrum before the real storm." The court date arrived on a stormy Wednesday morning. I wore a suit, brought every document I'd accumulated, and walked into the small courtroom where Karen was already seated with a high-priced attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She avoided eye contact, focusing instead on her prepared statement, which she read with the emotion of a soap opera audition. "I have suffered intimidation, property devaluation, and reptilian trauma," she declared. "Our community has been invaded, not just by gators, but by hostility." The judge, a tired-looking woman who'd probably heard more nonsense in a week than most here in a year, motioned to my attorney. He stood, passed her a thick folder of permits, land deeds, inspection reports, HOA financial misuse records, and photos of Karen personally directing the illegal construction. He then added a USB drive. These files include video footage of the defendant trespassing, the pool being built without permission, and the plaintiff stating she intended to use this property for HOA events without compensation or consent. The judge raised an eyebrow and plugged in the drive. The courtroom watched a clip of Karen yelling at workers to make it bigger, while standing next to a survey stake clearly marked with my name. By the time the footage ended, even her attorney looked embarrassed. Karen tried to speak, but the judge held up her hand. "I've heard enough. This is not only frivolous, but it borders on harassment. The defendant's permits are in order. His animals are legally housed. Your organization illegally constructed a recreational facility on private land. I'm denying your request and strongly advising you to seek legal counsel for your upcoming civil trial." Karen stood frozen for a moment before storming out of the room, muttering threats to sue everyone in sight. That afternoon, the story hit the local news again. This time the headline read, "Judge denies HOA Karen's emergency motion, calls pool construction illegal." The footage was almost comical, Karen being swarmed by reporters while trying to shove a camera away. Someone spliced it with the viral video of her yelling at the Gators from earlier, and the result became internet gold. Comments poured in from everywhere. People donated to a crowdfunding page. Someone had started to build a proper Gator sanctuary on HOA land. I didn't endorse it, but the gesture was hilarious. Meanwhile, the HOA board had called for an official emergency election to determine Karen's position. When the ballots came in, it wasn't even close. She was voted out by a margin of nearly 90%. Her response was to send out a group email titled, "You'll regret this," that included half-baked conspiracy theories about my supposed plan to turn the neighborhood into a reptile breeding farm. She even accused me of having ties to underground Gator wrestling circles, which was honestly more flattering than insulting. Her final act of desperation came one evening when she tried to sneak onto the property with bolt cutters. I was watching through my trail cams when I saw her silhouette crouched near the fence. By the time I stepped outside, she had already clipped one section and was crawling through like a raccoon in a business suit. I calmly turned on the spotlight, and her eyes went wide. "You're trespassing," I said. "Again." She stood up, sputtering something about taking back community assets, and I simply raised my phone. "Smile, Karen. You're already live streaming." That's when she bolted. I didn't chase her. I just made sure to email the footage to my lawyer. That incident was the final push. The HOA's new board held a special vote and officially banned Karen from holding any leadership position or organizing events for the foreseeable future. A few residents told me she'd put her house up for sale and was seen talking to a real estate agent while crying in her car. Her dream empire of lawn inspections and power trips had collapsed completely. By the end of the week, peace had returned. The Gators still swam in the pool, though now it was surrounded by new fencing and proper signage. I even added a little solar-powered waterfall to make it feel more natural. Dennis stopped by with a bag of frozen fish and said, "You know, this place is more peaceful than some wildlife centers I've seen." I nodded, watching one of the Gators blink slowly in the sun. "It's funny," I said. "She thought she could scare me with bureaucracy. Turns out, bureaucracy just needed a better lawyer." Everything Karen had done, every forged vote, every threat, every ounce of smug arrogance, had turned into the rope she used to hang her own reputation. All I'd done was stay calm, stay legal, and let the truth do the biting. And as I stood there, sipping my coffee beside a pool full of Gators that were now local celebrities, I realized the best revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, patient, and permanent. Just like the residents of my new Gator pond. A few weeks after Karen's meltdown at the fence, the neighborhood slipped back into something resembling normalcy. Well, if you call living next to a legally licensed Gator pond normal. The HOA had gone radio silent for a while as the new board worked to clean up the mess left behind. They sent out a public apology letter to every resident, including me. It was worded carefully, obviously vetted by a lawyer, but the message was clear. They were distancing themselves from Karen's reign of terror and trying to restore some kind of credibility. I appreciated the gesture, even if the words felt hollow. What mattered more was the sudden silence. No more random visits, no more surveillance drones, no more letters shoved into my mailbox demanding I trim my shrubs or paint my barn. It was like someone had flipped a switch and shut the madness off. Karen, meanwhile, had officially put her house on the market. The for sale sign went up 2 days after the HOA vote, and the listing quietly vanished from neighborhood forums where she used to post daily updates about lawn height compliance and acceptable curtain colors. Rumor had it she was moving out of state, though some said she was just moving 2 towns over. Wherever she was going, I doubted she'd find another neighborhood willing to hand her the power she once held here. She had become infamous, and not in the way she'd hoped. Her story had taken on a life of its own. People shared it like urban folklore. HOA forums across the state reposted the videos and pictures. There were even parody accounts that mimicked her signature email style, full of capital letters and dramatic overuse of exclamation points. As for me, I went back to my peaceful routines. I worked in my garden, maintained my land, and kept the Gators happy and healthy. Dennis stopped by regularly to do checkups and refill their food supplies. He brought over a group of wildlife interns one day for training, and I stood back watching them take notes like they were studying royalty. One of the interns leaned in to snap a picture, and the smallest gator raised its head and hissed just loud enough to make her stumble back into the grass. She laughed nervously, and Dennis said, "That one's got a sense of humor. Probably learned it from Cole." I shrugged. We all had to adapt to survive. Then one morning, something unexpected happened. A group of kids from the local middle school showed up with their teacher and a permission slip. Apparently, their science curriculum included studying protected species, and someone on the school board had reached out to the new HOA president who, in turn, asked if I'd be willing to let the students observe from outside the fence. I said yes, on the condition that they stay behind the marked line and no one tosses anything into the pond. The visit turned out to be a hit. The kids asked thoughtful questions, jotted notes, and stared wide-eyed as the gators glided through the water like prehistoric submarines. One of them raised his hand and asked, "Is it true this used to be a party pool?" I nodded. It was meant to be. Then someone forgot to ask permission. Now it's something more important. After that visit, word spread that my property had become an unofficial educational site. I didn't advertise, didn't charge, didn't post signs. But occasionally, a teacher or a scout leader would ask to bring their group by for a quick lesson on wildlife, conservation, or how not to anger your neighbor by building a pool on his land. I kept things low-key, informal, and always safe. No one got too close, and the gators mostly lounged like they were enjoying retirement. I found a sort of peace in it all. What began as a petty turf war had transformed into something meaningful. The civil case against Karen and the HOA reached its final phase soon after. With overwhelming evidence and public opinion heavily in my favor, the judge ruled that the HOA was liable for trespassing, unauthorized construction, and property damage. They were ordered to compensate me for every penny related to the cleanup, legal fees, and land restoration. Karen herself was named individually in the judgment for misappropriating community funds without proper board approval. Her personal liability wasn't astronomical, but enough to sting. When the decision came down, I didn't celebrate. I just let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It was over. Not just the pool or the court battles, but the constant war for control over something that had always been mine. That evening, I posted the final update to my original Reddit thread, the one I'd started weeks ago titled, "HOA Karen built a pool on my property for her guests, so I turned it into a gator pond." I included a few closing photos, one of the gators basking at sunset, one of the fence with the caution sign, and one of me holding the court judgment with a small smile on my face. My caption was simple. Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. Just add water, and a few well-placed reptiles. The post blew up again. Thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments. People asked if the gators had names, if I'd consider a YouTube channel, if I was planning to trademark the idea. Someone even asked if I'd give a TED Talk. I laughed at that one. I wasn't looking to go viral. I just wanted my land, my peace, and my space. And now, finally, I had it. One night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the moonlight dance on the surface of the pond, I heard the faint sounds of distant music and laughter. It wasn't from a wild party, just a couple of families from down the road enjoying a backyard dinner. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like noise. It felt like life returning to the neighborhood without Karen's shadow looming over it. The HOA board was still operating, but quietly, respectfully, and with actual transparency. No more surprise notices. No more threats. No more pretending to own what they didn't. And so the Gator Pond stayed, not just as a habitat or a monument to one woman's downfall, but as a symbol. A reminder that arrogance built on entitlement will always fall to patience built on principle. You can build a pool without permission. You can even throw a party in someone else's backyard. But when the water settles and the noise fades, the truth floats to the top, along with a few cold-blooded witnesses to make sure it stays there.